Hey everybody, how's it going? It's Mr. White here with your Unit 9 test review all about political revolution. So, you need to get out your test review paper. You also want to have out a piece of notebook paper and a pen or a pencil so you can write this down. If you don't have the test review paper, you can always download it from my Google site. Just check the info below this video. And without further ado, let's just go ahead and get right down to this test review. Okay, so the first thing that it asks about is absolutism. It wants to know, what is absolutism? Remember that absolutism is where the kings or any ruler basically makes decisions without the consent of their people. That's where the king can do basically anything he wants and nobody can complain about it. Some examples of absolute monarchs that we studied about in class were guys like Louis XIV and Louis XVI of France, as well as James I and Charles I of England. So remember those guys when we talk about absolute monarchies. Next up, it wants to know about the Enlightenment. In case you forgot what the Enlightenment is, just think about those Bugs Bunny cartoons that you used to watch when you were a kid. Anytime Bugs Bunny gets a really brilliant idea, what pops up above his head?
That's it!
A light bulb, right? So remember that light is a metaphor for intelligence, for wisdom, for knowledge. So the Enlightenment was a time when there was more wisdom and knowledge spreading around Europe. Basically, it was a time of great intellectual development, and it was when they continued that development of math and science that began during the scientific revolution, but they started adding in some new ideas about political philosophy. Some of those ideas were things like freedom, justice, and equality for everybody. Now, another name for the Enlightenment was the Age of Reason, and that's the second bullet point on there. The Age of Reason basically means the same time as the Enlightenment. It was the time when new ideas about government, science, philosophy, and other social ideas were spreading all throughout Europe. More and more people at this time started feeling that men were born with equal rights, especially with natural rights, and that government should be created to preserve people's natural rights. That's the most important function of government. So then the next thing it wants to know about are some of the Enlightenment thinkers and some of their most important ideas. The first guy that it asks about is Voltaire. You may notice that Voltaire starts with a V, so I think about the word voice, because Voltaire's most important idea was freedom of speech. One of his most famous quotes is, I may disagree with what you say, but I will give my life for your right to say it. And so that kind of encapsulates the idea of freedom of speech. The next guy is John Locke. John Locke was the guy who believed in natural rights. And if you forgot what natural rights are, he had a sort of a catchy phrase. He said life, liberty, and property. The idea that you shouldn't be allowed to be killed by the government or anybody else, the idea that you should be allowed to be free to make your own decisions, and the idea that you should be allowed to own things that belong to you and nobody else. So an easy way to remember John Locke is that you have to lock your property, right? You got to lock up your property so nobody steals it. Something else that John Locke was really into was the idea that if a government doesn't protect people's natural rights, that government can be overthrown. Okay, so John Locke, lock up your property. All right, next up, Hobbes. Now, I don't really have a cute way to remember John Hobbes. You're just going to have to put this in your brain. But John Hobbes was the guy who believed in something called the social contract. The idea that governments have responsibilities to their people, and the people also have a responsibility to the government. Next up is Montesquieu. Now, Montesquieu, you notice his name has 3 syllables in it, right? Montesquieu. So, when you remember that name, Montesquieu, I want you to think about 3 branches of government. The judicial, legislative, and executive branches. So because of his idea of the 3 branches of government, that's why we have checks and balances in our government today. And last up is Rousseau. Rousseau starts with an R, so think about Republican form of government. Republican form of government is where people vote for their representatives. And so this is what we call popular sovereignty. The people rule through voting for their leaders. All right, next up, we've got a question about the English Civil War and the English Bill of Rights. Well, the English Civil War, kind of like the French Revolution, was fought to overthrow an absolute monarch. That's one thing that those two have in common. And ultimately, after the chaos of the English Civil War, they had something called the Glorious Revolution, where a new king and queen were brought over from the Netherlands, and they had to sign a new English Bill of Rights. The English Bill of Rights basically limited the power of the monarchy and gave more protections to the people. So the one thing that you can remember about the English Civil War and the English Bill of Rights is that both of those limited the power of the monarchy in England. All right, next up, they want to know about natural rights, and we've kind of talked about this already. Remember that natural rights was something that John Locke came up with, and his natural rights were life, liberty, and property. We sometimes refer to these as unalienable rights, meaning that they can never be taken away because they're given to us by God. And he also said that governments that don't protect our natural rights are illegitimate and should be overthrown. Alrighty, next up, it wants to know about the job of government and people's rights if it does not do its job. So the job of a government is to protect its people's rights, especially their natural rights. And like I just said a minute ago, any government that does not protect their people's natural rights ought to be overthrown. All right, next up, it wants to know about Enlightenment's influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Declaration of Independence was from the American Revolution, and that was when the Americans were listing their grievances or reasons for wanting to break away from Great Britain. The Declaration of the Rights of Man, that was from the French Revolution. You may remember that was created after the Tennis Court Oath, and the whole purpose of that was to limit the power of the absolute monarchy in France. So the Enlightenment influenced both of those declarations by giving American and French people the belief that a government who denies people basic rights should be overthrown. Okay? Next up, it would like to know about the influence on the American and French revolutions. So the Enlightenment influenced the American and French revolutions because people in both places wanted a guarantee of certain basic human rights, aka natural rights. Most importantly, they wanted the government to respect their life, liberty, and property, and to promote equality so that there were no different classes. And all this was due to the influence of the Enlightenment. Alrighty, so next up it wants to know about principles of government. The first one is about separation of powers. Remember that separation of powers means that nowadays many democratic governments have three branches. A legislative branch that makes the law, an executive branch that judges the law, or excuse me, an executive branch that executes the law, and a judicial branch that judges the law. So those three branches divide up the power and they check up on each other so that no one branch can become too powerful. This was motivated by absolute monarchies because you may remember that in an absolute monarchy, it's one person who has the power to make the law, judge the law, and enforce the law. The next thing it wants to know about is popular sovereignty. Now that's a fancy sounding word that means power to the people. So in a popular sovereignty, whoever is most popular gets to rule. So popular sovereignty is based on the idea that a government's power comes from the consent of the people. If the people don't agree with the government, then that government is not legitimate. All right, next up it wants to know about the American Revolution. First of all, it wants to know the political causes for the American Revolution. The political cause, or the most important political cause I should say, was that King George III, the guy who was the king at the time, took away the colonists' rights to representation in Parliament. You may remember that going all the way back to the time of Magna Carta, people in England were used to having representatives who could advise the king and help the king make laws. Of course, the American colonists didn't have that right, and so that leads us to our next cause of the American Revolution, which were the economic causes. A major economic cause for the American Revolution was taxation without representation. So what was happening was those American colonists had no representatives in Parliament, yet they were being taxed. And many of them felt that that was a violation of the basic principles set forth in Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. Okay? One other thing that was an economic cause was mercantilism. You might remember that the English colonists who were living in the New World had no freedom to trade with anybody that they wanted. They were forced to trade with England only. All right, and then next up it wants to know about the impact and the influences of the American Revolution. The most important impact is that America gained our independence from Great Britain. And it also established a government that was based on Enlightenment ideals. Ideas like natural rights, separation of powers, checks and balances, freedom of speech, all those things that we just talked about. And one final thing that the American Revolution did was that it inspired other independence movements all across the Americas, especially in Latin America. All right, next up it wants to know about the French Revolution, and it also wants to know political and economic causes. So the political causes for the French Revolution were that France was ruled by a divine right monarchy. Divine right monarchy means the same thing as absolute monarchy. So the king had all the power, and the people had no power. You might also remember that during that time period, the king called together a group of the different social classes in France, the Estates General, and the Estates General failed to solve a lot of the problems that France was going through at that time. And last of all, the French Revolution was influenced by Enlightenment ideals. So those are some of the political causes for the French Revolution. Next up, economic causes. First of all, France was in an economic crisis. Their country was bankrupt because of a wasteful monarchy and several costly wars that they had fought. And when it came time to solve this problem, there was a refusal by the government to tax the wealthy classes. You may remember that the wealthy classes were the first and second estates. The peasants, the third estate, paid almost all of the taxes, yet they had the least amount of income. And so that was one of the biggest economic reasons for the French Revolution. Next thing it wants to know about is the tennis court oath. The tennis court oath is what happened during the Estates General. You may remember that the first and second estate, the two rich classes, they locked out the third estate, the poor classes, and basically didn't want to listen to any of their suggestions. So the third estate went across the street from the Estates General, and there happened to be a tennis court that was open. They got together on this tennis court, and they swore that they would continue meeting until they created a new constitution. So at the tennis court oath, the third estate created a new national assembly and eventually abolished the absolute monarchy of France. Next up, it wants to know about the divine right versus people's participation in the government. Basically, what that means is divine right monarchs, they don't respect the rights of their people. As a matter of fact, if you're a divine right monarch, you don't even call your people, you call them your subjects because they are subject to your will. Whereas in a republic, like what we have and what France has today, the people are known as citizens because the people are the ones in charge. Okay, so that's really the big difference between a divine right monarchy and a republic, is that in a divine right monarchy, the people are subjects, whereas in a republic, the people are citizens and they actually have a say. Next up is Reign of Terror. Okay, when we talk about the Reign of Terror, that was that time period of the French Revolution after they got rid of the king, when the government was really paranoid that there were enemies of the revolution everywhere. And so they started chopping off everybody's heads with that crazy machine, the guillotine, to try to make sure that everybody stayed loyal to the revolution. So anyone suspected of supporting the king or criticizing the revolution was subject to arrest and eventual beheading. Ew. People were terrified, and that's why they called it the Reign of Terror. So last off, it wants to know about the impact and the influence of the French Revolution. For one thing, the French people established a republic based on Enlightenment ideals. That was one of the most important impacts of the French Revolution. They also abolished absolute monarchy in France. And last of all, they inspired revolutions in other parts of the world, like Latin America. Okay, next up, it wants to know about the American versus the French revolutions. Well, they were both pretty similar. We talked about how they were both influenced by the Enlightenment and they both wanted to limit the power of an absolute monarch, but they weren't completely the same. Remember that both wanted their government to respect their rights, but the difference was that the French people overthrew their own existing social order. Like they overthrew a king that was actually in their country, whereas the American colonists were overthrowing a distant colonial ruler. You know, King George didn't actually live in the 13 colonies. So that was sort of a big difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. All right, next up, it wants to know about Napoleon. You may remember that Napoleon was one of the most important guys in history. He was chosen as consul of France because the people believed that he could solve their problems, and they wanted a strong leader after all the chaos of the French Revolution. That was why he was chosen as the leader. And he had a lot of impacts. Maybe you remember these from the video, maybe not. But the first major impact of Napoleon was that he granted legal equality to the middle class. Another thing that he did was he improved education all throughout Europe. Next up, he created something called the Continental System, which was sort of a way that he was trying to hurt the British by blocking them from trading with ports that were under French control. Of course, that ended up being a disaster because the British were really big in trade back then. So blocking the British from trading with France actually hurt the economy of Europe. Next up, Napoleon was somebody who spread nationalism throughout Europe. He got people to start loving their country and believing that their people were the best and that they should have the right to determine their own future. Next up, he enhanced personal liberty. And last of all, he started wars with other European countries. We called those the Napoleonic Wars. You may remember that he was eventually defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, which is a little town in Belgium. Okay, next up, it wants to know about the Latin American revolutions. Specifically, it wants to know about some of the leaders of the Latin American revolutions. The first one is Simón Bolívar. If you watch the Latin American revolutions video, you ought to know who he is. He was the leader of independence in places like Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. Okay. Next up, it wants to know about José de San Martín. He was the leader of independence in Argentina and Chile. And the reason why both of these guys are important is because they were influenced by Enlightenment ideals, and they were also influenced by the American and French revolutions. Next up, it asks about the Haitian Revolution, which kind of goes along with the Latin American revolutions. That was something else that was in the video about Latin American revolutions. And it's asking about Toussaint Louverture. Okay, he was actually born as an African slave living in Haiti, which was called French Saint-Domingue. And he led the rebellion against France in Haiti and helped Haiti gain its independence from France. All right, now there's a few review questions on this test, just things that we've learned about in previous chapters. The first thing it's asking about is the Renaissance. What it wants to know about the Renaissance is the characteristics and what was studied and imitated. Remember that the Renaissance was a rebirth of art and culture in Europe. It was something that was instigated by things like the Crusades, and the impact was that classical cultures of Greece and Rome were studied and imitated by European artists. Remember guys like Michelangelo, who created statues like David, or Botticelli, who painted that famous painting called The Birth of Venus. Those were based on classical Greco-Roman themes. And the last review question is about European exploration. It wants to know, why did Europeans go exploring? Okay, well, the reason why they went exploring is that they wanted to find new trade routes, especially trade routes to Asia, and they were looking to seize new lands to increase their power. Just think about God, gold, and glory. Okay, guys, well, that's it. We are at the end of our test review. Now remember, there's that one last little part about the short answer prompts. I think last time a lot of you did not prepare for the short answer prompts. So when I say that you need to read all of those questions and come up with at least a list of things you want to talk about, I'm being serious, guys, okay? Remember that the short answer questions are worth 10 points. If you're in K level, you're going to have to do 2 short answer prompts. So you've got 4 possible prompts that could be asked. Make sure that you know what you want to say for all 4. If you're in on level, you've got 2 possible prompts. And once again, it's going to be worth 10 points. I'm going to ask you one of those 2 questions. So if you're smart, I would recommend that you should come up with something to say for each of them, so that regardless of which one I ask you, you're prepared and you can get those 10 points on your test. Okay, guys, well, that's pretty much it. Now it's your job to study. Remember that if you just write this stuff down and never look at it again, it's not going to help you very much, okay? So go over this again as many times as it takes. Come into the test prepared, and we'll see you next time.